Welcome to lecture 19 of week 4 of the BHU SWAYAM course titled Aspects of Cultural Studies. I am Dr. Dhriti Redalai, Professor, Department of English, Faculty of Arts, Banaras Hindu University, the co-instructor of this course along with Professor P. Dalai. In the previous lecture on disability studies, I had introduced the nature and scope of disability studies and how the formation of the category of disability takes place in the West. The current lecture is a departure in the sense that it is specifically dealing with the Indian context. It is designed to probe into the disability question in the Indian context. We will find not only the influence of disability studies as it has evolved in the West, working on the Indian scholars, but we will also notice how they are grappling with a reality and situation that is uniquely Indian. We move on to the first slide of the lecture, and there is a reference to the body ideal found in the Puranas. Now, the reference is to Ashish Jaiswal, the Oxford scholar, who in his book Fluid, the approach applied by geniuses over centuries, brings in the Vishnu Dharmottaram Puranam, which supposedly contains the first ever extensive measurements of the perfectly proportionate human body. There is this discourse which is taking place between Rishi Markandeya and King Vajra. And Rishi Markandeya is explaining to King Vajra how to create perfect representations of gods and goddesses. Now, the image that Ashish Jaiswal refers to provides a mathematical and scientific perspective, and there is a description of 5 types of perfect men and 5 types of perfect women of varying heights and proportions. Now, I have deliberately not brought in the image here because of copyright issues. Now, the question that puzzles us is that while cultural studies tends to take a global or national view of culture, disability studies raises the issue of whether a single identity, that is disability, sufficient to identify a culture other than the ableist one. So, in the previous lecture, we found an example of that ableist culture in the depiction of Leonardo da Vinci's sketch of the Vitruvian Man, and similarly in the Indian context, it is the Vishnu Dharmottaram Puranam which provides us with an similar ableist depiction of the human form. But to problematize this further, in disability studies discourse, scholars are of the opinion that culture differs from group to group. That is, the deaf culture stands distinct from the culture which is specific to the visually impaired. Disability studies also acknowledges that the disabled have different experiences across cultures and time. For example, in the Yoruba tribe, which is a West African tribe, the disabled are revered. They are supposed to be closer to Obatala, that is the deity or the creator of the human body. So, we find that there is this possibility that the disability culture and the experiences of disability may vary across cultures and time. Now, when you come to the Indian context, and that is disability studies in India, we will find that it lags behind the Western disability studies project. In fact, it was in the 1980s that at Hunter College, New York, there was a disability studies project initiated by scholars like Simi Linton, Leonard J. Davis, and they were trying to provide a curriculum to acquaint faculty with the field and to lobby for its inclusion in the diversity initiative. So what was happening in New York was probably not happening in India. So disability studies as a formal area of academic inquiry has been making steady strides in the global north since the late 80s, but that has not been the case in India. So what do you find here? That disability studies scholarship is in a nascent stage. Disability studies is also neglected in Indian academia, and this is according to Anita Ghai, one of the very important voices of the disability rights movement and disability studies in India. And she realizes that how trajectories of disability right movement and disability studies are significantly different in India due to a large population and multiplicity of marginalization, leading to intersectionality of class, caste, gender, religion in the Indian context. We will also note that awareness about the issues and concerns of lives touched with disabilities is a fairly recent phenomena. And in the Indian context, and especially in the rural areas of India, it would not be a surprise for us to find that there could be impaired individuals who are not even aware of the rights and privileges that are available to them. And India, disability studies as an interdisciplinary area of study that values the experiential realities of disability is still not fully expanded. The scholarship is also limited in the sense that the multifaceted nature of disability from various disciplinary and cross-disciplinary standpoints, socio-cultural contexts, lived experiences of people with disabilities is not clearly understood. So there remains a dearth of empirical research on disability in the global south as well. So disabled people's history in India is largely a history of silence. The momentum that disability scholars took was basically from the West, and later on we will realize that it attempted to be a corollary to the rights movement in India as well. Now, there is a lot of debate about the beginnings of disability right movement in India, but like I was telling you that there have been impetus taken from the West and how disability rights movement is a corollary to the rights movement. So, like the Dalit movement or the socialist movement or the Naxalite movement, disability rights movement is also a post-independent phenomena in India. And yes, it also focuses on discrimination, oppression, rights and privileges. Very, very interestingly, I was telling you how there has been a lot of debate about the beginnings of disability rights movement in India, and here I have tried to incorporate various opinions of disability scholars coming from India, and I start with the first observation made by Jagdish Chandra. He traces the emergence of disability as a political construct through the evolution of the disability rights movement, particularly through the agitation of the organized blind in India in the form of the National Federation of the Blind. And here I may bring in the name of Justice Baharul Islam, who recommended in 1986 the enactment of a comprehensive disability law. So there was a call for the enactment of the disability law several times from 1981 onwards, particularly from 1985 to 87. Now we move on from Jagdish Chandar to Anita Ghai, who opines that DRM in India got initiated with the declaration of 1981 as the International Year of Disabled People. Nilika Mehrotra claims that disability studies originated from activism across various Western contexts, and she also claims that disability rights movement in India received a boost with the launch of the Asian and Pacific Decade of Disabled Persons in 1993. Now, the UNCRPD that had been referred to in my previous lecture is what Renu Adalakha identifies as the influence on disability studies and disability rights movement in India. So, she believes that the UNCRPD and PWD have initiated a shift in the construction of disability from the medical and charity models to human rights model of disability in India. So, this much for the beginnings of DRM and DS in India. Now, what are the peculiarities of the Indian disability scene? And I again refer to Anita Ghai, who tries to make a distinction between disability studies and the scholar's opinion as in the West vis-a-vis the reality of disability studies and disability rights movement in the Indian context. Unlike the West, and I am quoting Ghai here, the understanding of in India does not differentiate between impairment, disability and handicap, and uses the terms synonymously with a firm cultural grounding in destiny. You know, in my previous lecture, I had referred to the World Health Organization classification of 1980, where we found separation between the concepts of impairment, disability and handicap. But in the Indian context, it is almost a common thing for the non-disabled to use these terms of impairment, disability and handicap almost synonymously. Within the dominant Indian cultural ethos, labels such as disability, handicap, crippled, blind and deaf are used almost synonymously. Labels such as Bechara, you know, I had referred to the charity model. I had talked about how there is a range of emotions that the disabled, you know, brings out in the non-disabled. It could be revulsion, it could be pity, it could be fear. So, there is this element of pity, and the terminology that is used frequently is Bechara. So, poor thing, to accentuate the victim status of the disabled in India. And the roots of such attitudes lie in cultural conceptions. Now, before we go into the fundamental act for the persons with disability, it was in 1987 that society had the Mental Health Act passed by the government. Now, the Mental Health Act confirms this right to be admitted, treated, cared in a psychiatric hospital or psychiatric nursing home or convalescent home established or maintained by the government or any other person for the treatment and care of mentally ill persons. The next provision has how mentally ill prisoners and minors have a right of treatment in psychiatric hospitals or psychiatric nursing homes of the government. Now, I am referring to a report titled "Treated Worse Than Animals, Abuses Against Women and Girls with Psychosocial or Intellectual Disabilities in Institutions in India." Now, this report was part of the survey that took place across 6 cities in India, and it is reported that the inmates experience overcrowding, lack of hygiene, forced electroconvulsive therapy, as well as physical, verbal and sexual violence. So, this was the report on the realities of such psychiatric hospitals and nursing homes of the government. Then we have the Rehabilitation Council of India Act of 1992. Now, with the passing of this act, the Indian writings in the rehabilitation field obviously tried to incorporate the changes, tried to include this change in congruence with the international standards, but social and cultural perceptions are definitely yet to change. What you find is stereotypical labels operative, such as Surdas for the blind, Langri for the cripple, Mand Buddhi for the mentally retarded. This is according to Ranjita Dawn in her book, The Social Model of Disability in India, Politics of Identity and Power. Now, with this we come to the most important and initial acts, that is Persons with Disabilities Act of 1995, which offered equal opportunities, protection of rights and full participation of the disabled. Many believe that subsequent to the passage of this federal legislation, disability issues gained visibility across the social and political stages in India. Now, before the PWD Act, there was also a very important change in the establishment of the first statutory body called the Rehabilitation Council of India, which started functioning in 1992. There is also in 1994 the creation of the Disabled Rights Group, or DRG, where disabled people from diverse disability groups joined hands and actively lobbied for the passage of landmark legislation. But it is not a secret that until the 49th year of independence, the first legislation advocating equal rights for disabled people became a living reality. The 2016 Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act was in keeping with the proposal made by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and it was also agreed how respect for inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices, was to be made mandatory for the disabled population. It is going to be non-discrimination, and a respect for difference and acceptance of persons with disabilities as part of human diversity and humanity was upheld. There is an amendment bill of 2022 where you have the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which seeks to amend the previous one with the view to specify the term persons with mental disabilities and provide them reservation in higher educational institutions and in posts of the establishments of the appropriate government. Now, these are some of the pieces of legislation that have tried to intervene in the lives of the disabled. But few problems remain, and one of the first problems of the Indian disability scenario is that of intersectionality. And Anita Ghai is one who keeps highlighting on the deficit in Western disability studies, which fails to comprehend the reality of disability in India, which is marked by a complex amalgam of caste, class and gender issues. She is also of the opinion that disability as an excess of social categorization has been overlooked by Indian feminists. There is also a hierarchy of impairments according to Nilika Mehrotra, and this is something which is peculiar to India. There is also the frequent use of the symbol of the wheelchair, which obscures the differences within the movement. Unlike the clear-cut distinction between the various models as operative in the West, in India you find that charity, pity and the religious models are still operative. And there are overwhelming images of dependency, the notion of punishment for misdeeds, or the notion of bad karma leading to disability. The other criticism of disability studies in India is that it is highly dispersed and often elitist in nature. So like the point that I was making in my earlier lecture and also in this one, that what if we believe that the disability scholars are all centered around the metros or the important cities of India? How much of this discourse has percolated down and reached the villager who lives in the rural part of India? So this is again a criticism of disability studies and the disability rights movement in India. Discussions on the relationship between sexuality and disability in the global south has remained hitherto a limited area of study. And here again I may give you an example from our past and literature coming from the past, and the example is in Surpanakha's deformity as a punishment for transgressing the boundaries. So if the body were to be deformed, sexuality would be curtailed. Is this the message that the text wants to project? We ask. The problems continue in a sense that there is a lack of public planning. Now the legislations that are operative in India are based on the medical model, and the social model of disability is something which is still not accepted or is not something which is in operation. The physical environment therefore is largely inaccessible and inconvenient. The dissemination of information in formats accessible to people with sensory impairments is restricted. There is non-availability of assistive devices like electrically powered wheelchairs at affordable prices in India. When I was telling you about the rights model in my previous lecture, I talked about James Charlton and how he talked about wheelchairs as being part of the basic right of the American. But that is not the case in India. There is also the notion of family as the providers of care for the disabled, and it is also a very, very gendered notion. You know, Upali Chakravarti has worked extensively on this gendered notion of care, and the idea is that it is a very problematical notion. The caregiver, who would often be the mother or the sister or the wife, is conflicted when it comes to her emotions, and it is complicated. Why is it that there is the concomitant presence of depression, anger, resentment as well as duty? With this we come to the term Divyang, which is now being promoted, and it all started with PM Narendra Modi's radio address on 27th December 2015, and he suggested that the term Divyang may be incorporated instead of Viklang. Disability rights activists and organizations were opposing the central government's decision to incorporate this change in its Hindi and English nomenclatures. Now, the disability rights activists reject this suggestion because they do not want to associate disability with anything that has to do with divinity, because the disabled are not blessed with a divine organ. And they ask, how can human diversities be divine in nature? Is it a way to absolve the responsibility of the community? Is it another way of making the individual responsible for his or her own impairment rather than making it a social issue? So, they are of the opinion that invoking divinity will not lessen the stigma, something that we have looked into by referring to Goffman's work on stigma, and discrimination that persons with disabilities have been historically subjected to and continue to encounter in their daily lives. Now we move on to another segment of this particular lecture where I talk about etiquette. And by etiquette we mean conduct, that is public conduct. In our childhood, we have been taught about the significance and importance of those magic words like please and thank you. But are we conscious of disability etiquette? Are we knowledgeable about the code of behavior that should allow us to interact civilly with the disabled? So, how can we incorporate disability etiquette into our daily lives? Now, these are few very basic suggestions that I have put forward for your understanding. Now, the first reference is to the wheelchair user, and you also mark how language is crucial. In a sense, we do not perpetuate ableism and disabilism. Instead of using the term wheelchair bound, we may use wheelchair user. Instead of referring to someone as dying from cancer, we may say living with cancer. So, coming back to the etiquette involving the wheelchair users, the first suggestion is that we should leave 3 meters for access. By this we mean that the wheelchair has to maneuver, and for that you have to allow 3 meters of space, something which is overlooked very, very often. There cannot be a willful touching of the wheelchair if it is not permitted by the user, because the wheelchair is understood to be an extension of the identity of the user. You cannot maneuver the wheelchair as you wish. Sometimes it has been reported how the non-disabled are curious to know how it feels to sit on a wheelchair and would request the use of the wheelchair. So, these are certain violations that we have to keep in mind when we are having an interaction with a wheelchair user. We have to get down to the level of sight of the wheelchair user as well. There is also a lot of knowledge which comes from the domain of disability, and there is this notion of the ambulatory wheelchair users. Now, who are these ambulatory wheelchair users? Ambulatory wheelchair users often face discrimination and judgment because they use the wheelchair when they find it necessary. So, if someone is suffering from chronic fatigue or exhaustion, he or she may have to use the wheelchair. But he or she is also able to walk, but the non-disabled population will not take it kindly, this switching from the use of wheelchair to walking. We would believe that the wheelchair user is faking his or her impairment. For the visually impaired, we find that the cane, the white cane, is the obvious sign of impairment. But data has revealed that fewer than 2% of visually impaired people use a white cane to navigate. And it is not very difficult for us to understand why. It is because of the stigma that is associated with visual impairment that would allow someone to hide and not use the cane. The color of the cane can also indicate the user's visual impairment or hearing impairment. So, if the cane has red and white stripes, it indicates that the user is deaf blind, meaning they have both sight and hearing impairments. Before we move on to the next slide, I would try to draw your attention that you cannot offer your assistance if it has not been solicited. It means that if a visually impaired person requires assistance, then you have to offer your arm gently, and you have to also prepare yourself for a rejection, because after all you have to understand how the people with disabilities are wanting to live with dignity. But very, very importantly, we cannot leave them in a free space where the person has absolutely no clue as to his whereabouts. So, we cannot leave them in a free space. When it comes to the disability etiquette involving the hearing impaired, you will find that there are over 300 sign languages in the world, which is something almost unknown to many of the non-disabled. So, there are 300 sign languages. There are distinctions between the American Sign Language, the British Sign Language, as well as the Indian Sign Language. The Indian Sign Language would use both the hands, whereas the American Sign Language would use only one. Now, the hearing impaired would not even want to be considered a part of the disabled community, because they would say that they cannot relate to the problems of the disabled, because they would rather say that they belong to a linguistic minority because they use sign language. And like any other linguistic minority, they also come to be identified as a linguistic minority. So, these are the references that have gone on to shape this particular lecture, and with this I come to the end of the second lecture on disability studies, which has tried to deal specifically with the Indian context. Thank you.